Dust fell from the rattling ventilation grates, catching the flicker of a dying neon tube, before settling on the oil-slicked floor. The air in the lower orbital docks didn't just smell bad. It had a texture. It tasted like burnt ozone stale sweat and the sharp metallic tang of vaporized copper. Maeve leaned against the rusted bulkhead, her coveralls clinging to her spine with cold perspiration. She was exhausted, a bone-deep, marrow-sucking kind of tired that made her vision blur around the edges. She didn't want to be a hero. She just wanted the remaining credits owed for fixing the atmospheric scrubbers on this floating junk heap. Standing between her and the exit was Garrett. Garrett wasn't entirely human anymore, not that anyone out in the belt was. He was a second-generation void-born spliced with heavy dermal plating and muscle grafts designed for zero-gravity cargo hauling. He stood 7 feet tall, his chest as wide as a blast door, skin a pale, sickly gray, crisscrossed with the dark veins of subdermal combat wiring. He looked down at Maeve, his eyes completely replaced by matte black optical implants. "You're not listening, little earther," Garrett rumbled. The vocal synthesizer in his throat gave his words a synthetic buzzing quality, like a swarm of hornets trapped in a tin can. The contract was voided. You don't get paid. You don't get to leave. Maeve spat a glob of phlegm onto the deck. It landed near his heavy steel-toed boots. "The scrubbers work. My part is done. Give me the chit." Garrett sighed an exaggerated heave of synthetic lungs. He didn't even shift his stance. He just snapped his right arm forward. The backhand caught Maeve square in the jaw. She didn't fly backward like in the holovids. She just dropped. Gravity and sudden trauma folded her like a cheap deck chair. Her knees slammed into the grated floor, tearing the fabric of her pants and peeling the skin beneath. Her head rang a high-pitched whine that drowned out the hum of the station's reactors. She tasted copper. Real copper, warm and salty, flooding her mouth from a split lip and a bitten tongue. For a moment, the world was nothing but a sickening tilt. Nausea rolled in her stomach. Her instinct, honed by 1,000 miserable hours in dockyard brawls, screamed at her to stay down, to play dead, to let the giant have his ego trip. Garrett laughed. It was a wet, grating sound. He rolled his shoulders, the synthetic plates shifting under his pale skin. He was smirking. She could see it in the arrogant curl of his lip, the relaxed slump of his massive frame. He hadn't even used a fraction of his hydraulic strength. He was playing with his food. "Look at you," Garrett sneered, kicking a stray lug nut toward her knee. "Fragile, dense, heavy bones and nowhere to run. Stay down, earther. It's better for your health." Maeve stared at the floor grating. She watched a single drop of her own spit and blood slip through the mesh into the dark beneath. The pain in her jaw was a dull, hot throb, radiating up into her left temple. She felt a profound, exhausting wave of irritation. Not righteous fury, just the weary frustration of a woman who had pulled a 12-hour shift and was now dealing with a middle management thug who thought biomods beat millions of years of high-gravity evolution. She didn't posture. She didn't spit out a snappy comeback. Maeve just stood up. It wasn't a graceful ascent. Her left leg shook slightly. She kept her chin tucked, her eyes locked on Garrett's chest rather than his face. She wiped the back of her grease-stained hand across her mouth, smearing the crimson across her cheek. Garrett's smirk widened. He tapped his own jaw, pointing to a thick slab of dermal armor, plating bolted to the bone beneath his skin. "Go ahead. Take your shot. Let's get it out of your system." He widened his stance, dropping his hands entirely, presenting his face. He expected a frantic, flailing strike. He expected the desperate panic of a cornered animal. Maeve let out a slow, rattling breath. The air hissed through her teeth. She planted her feet. The gravity on Earth was a crushing, unforgiving mistress. It built bones like forged steel. It wove muscle fibers tight and dense. Out here in the low G systems, the Voidborn grew tall, fast, and arrogant. They forgot what a true gravity well did to a primate's physiology. She didn't punch from the shoulder. She punched from the floor. Her right foot dug into the grating. The kinetic chain started in her calf, snapped through her hips, twisted her torso, and launched her right arm forward. She didn't aim for the armored plate on his jaw. She aimed for the soft, fleshy hinge just beneath the ear, where the synthetic grafts met natural cartilage. The impact sounded like a mechanic taking a sledgehammer to a defective engine block. A sharp, wet crack echoed through the bay. The shockwave of the hit traveled back up Maeve's arm, sending a blinding jolt of agony through her wrist and elbow. She felt a knuckle dislocate the bone slipping out of its socket with a sickening pop. She stumbled back, cradling her ruined hand against her chest, gasping for air. Garrett didn't stagger. He didn't scream. His optical implants flickered rapidly, flashing from black to static white. His massive frame went entirely rigid, the combat wiring in his neck short-circuiting in a shower of blue sparks. The sheer blunt force trauma had bypassed his dermal armor, transferring all of its kinetic energy directly into his inner ear and the delicate unarmored brainstem behind it. For 2 agonizingly slow seconds, Garrett stood perfectly upright, his smirk frozen on his face. Then, like a felled redwood, he tipped backward. He crashed into the steel decking with a thunderous boom that shook the dust from the ceiling all over again. He didn't twitch. He didn't breathe. Maeve stood over him, her chest heaving, the stench of burnt wiring filling her nostrils. She kicked his ribs lightly with her boot. Nothing. She reached into his utility belt, pulled out the credit chit, and hobbled toward the exit, nursing her broken hand and cursing the entire miserable sector. Sensory input returned not as a trickle, but as a violent, abrasive flood. Garrett felt the smell first. It was the sharp, sterile sting of heavy-duty chemical cleansers and the unmistakable sweet decay of necrotic tissue. It burned the inside of his nostrils, making his throat constrict. Then came the sound. A steady rhythmic beep. A synthetic heart monitor. Below that, a deep oceanic roaring filled his ears as if he were trapped inside the turbine of a localized terraforming engine. He tried to open his eyes, but his eyelids felt as though they had been fused shut with industrial adhesive. Panic, cold and primal, spiked in his chest. He attempted to thrash to throw off the heavy blanket covering him, but his limbs refused to obey. They felt impossibly distant, like phantom attachments to a core that was currently on fire. "Don't move," a voice rasped. It was a dry, papery sound, devoid of bedside manner. Garrett forced his eyes open. The bright, unforgiving light of a surgical lamp stabbed into his optical receptors. He blinked, the mechanical shutters of his eyes grinding with a terrible, gritty friction. When the glare finally resolved, he saw the peeling white ceiling of a back alley med bay. A face swam into view. It was Simon, the station's unlicensed cybernetics surgeon. The man looked older than dirt, his skin spotted with radiation burns, a magnifier monocle screwed into his left eye socket. "What?" Garrett tried to speak, but his voice synthesizer produced only a garbled, screeching burst of static. His throat felt like it had been packed with shattered glass. "I said don't move, you colossal idiot," Simon muttered, turning away to adjust a drip on an IV line hooked into Garrett's arm. "You're lucky to be breathing. Actually, you're not breathing on your own. The machine is doing it for you. Your autonomic nervous system took a vacation." Garrett swallowed a jagged, agonizing motion. The memories were fragmented. A docking bay, the smell of ozone, the small, dirty earther mechanic, the smirk. He remembered inviting the hit. A fresh wave of nausea rolled over him. He tried to turn his head to the side, but a thick cervical collar locked his neck in place. The pain radiating from the base of his skull was absolute. It wasn't a sharp pain. It was a vast crushing pressure, as if his brain was swelling against the inside of his skull, begging for a release valve. The human Garrett managed to croak the synthesizer, finally engaging on a lower baser frequency. It sounded pathetic, weak. Simon let out a short, humorless bark of laughter. He grabbed a datapad from a nearby tray and tapped the screen with a grease-stained finger. "The human," Simon echoed. "Right. Let me read you the damage report, tough guy. You suffered a grade 4 concussion. The kinetic transfer from the blunt force impact bypassed your jaw plating entirely. Do you know what happens when a localized force of roughly 1,200 pounds per square inch strikes the unsecured hinge of a jawbone?" Garrett just stared at the ceiling, his breathing shallow and rapid. "It acts as a lever," Simon explained, his voice entirely devoid of sympathy. "It drove the condyle of your mandible backward, fracturing your temporal bone and sending a shock wave directly into your cerebellum. You suffered a massive cerebrospinal fluid leak. Your combat implants tried to compensate for the sudden loss of motor function and ended up frying your upper spinal column." Garrett's synthetic lungs hissed. 1,200 pounds of force, from a baseline human female weighing barely 60 kilos. It was biologically impossible. She hadn't used a tool. She hadn't used a pneumatic gauntlet. She had just used her skeleton. "She broke her hand," Simon added casually, turning back to the monitors. "Saw her down at the clinic. Nasty compound fracture. But she walked out. You had to be scraped off the deck with a hover stretcher." The humiliation burned hotter than the physical pain. Garrett, the terror of the lower docks, a genetically spliced enforcer, laid out by a single unaugmented punch. He remembered her face right before she swung. There hadn't been anger. There had just been an exhausting, crushing determination. The gravity of Earth distilled into a single terrifying instant of violence. "How?" Garrett whispered the word, scraping against his ruined throat. "Gravity," Simon said simply, as if reading his mind. "We grow tall and brittle in the void, Garrett. We put steel on our bones to pretend we're hard. But those earthers, they evolve under a constant crushing weight. Their bones are chalky stone compared to our porous lattice. When they decide to plant their feet and throw their mass, you don't stand in front of it." Garrett closed his eyes. The oceanic roaring in his ears hadn't subsided. He felt a profound sense of dislocation. The world he knew, the hierarchy of the docks based on size and synthetic upgrades, had been shattered by a single greasy mechanic who just wanted her paycheck. He tried to calculate the lost time, the medbay fees, the cost of repairing the fried implants. He needed to know how long he had been lying on this table, vulnerable and unconscious. He needed to know how much ground he had lost. He forced his eyes open again, staring at the flickering fluorescent light above. "Simon," Garrett rasped, his voice trembling, despite his best efforts to suppress it. The fear was seeping in now. The primal dread of a predator that had just discovered it was actually prey. "How long was I out? How long have I been here?" Simon paused, setting the datapad down on the metal tray with a soft clatter. He looked down at Garrett, his one good eye, devoid of its usual cynical amusement. There was only a grim, clinical pity. "Garrett," Simon said quietly, wiping his hands on a dirty rag. Garrett felt a cold spike of adrenaline pierce through the haze of painkillers. "What year is it?" Garrett demanded, panic finally breaking through his stoicism. Simon sighed, a heavy, tired sound. Just rest, Garrett. We've got a long way to go. 8 months and 12 days. Simon's voice lacked any theatrical weight. It was just a measurement of time, delivered alongside a plastic cup containing 2 chalky, bitter-smelling pain suppressants. He set the cup on the metal tray beside the surgical bed, the clatter loud in the cramped, sterile room. Garrett didn't move. He couldn't. His brain processed the words, but they felt abstract, like a mathematical equation he lacked the cipher to solve. 8 months, 250 cycles of the station's artificial day-night rotation. "You're lying," Garrett forced out. His voice synthesizer didn't buzz with its usual, intimidating bass. It clicked and wheezed, a cheap replacement model that sounded like a failing air filter. "I run a clandestine chop shop. Garrett, not a temporal distortion field." Simon adjusted the greasy magnifying lens over his eye, leaning in to inspect the junction of synthetic skin and natural flesh along Garrett's jawline. "You suffered a traumatic brain injury. Coma. Most of the time void-born with your level of neurological splicing, don't wake up at all. The interface rejects the dormant brain. You got lucky. Lucky." The word tasted like battery acid in Garrett's mouth. He managed to tilt his head. The cervical collar was gone, replaced by a stiff, restrictive mesh woven directly into his neck muscles. He looked down at his own body and felt a cold, hollow vacuum open up in his chest. He was small. The massive military-grade dermal plates that had armored his chest and shoulders were gone. In their place was pale, atrophied flesh, crisscrossed with jagged pink incision scars. The hydraulic subdermal grafts that gave his arms their terrifying, bone-crushing thickness had been stripped out. His arms were thin, the muscles wasted from disuse hanging off his frame like wet rags. "Where's my gear?" Garrett's breath hitched a sudden spike of panic, tightening his throat. "Where's my plating?" Simon didn't look up from his datapad. "Repossessed. By Braddock. Medical bills out here aren't cheap, big guy. Keeping your meat alive on life support for the better part of a year burned through your hazard pay in the first 6 weeks. Braddock held the lease on your combat mods. When it became clear you weren't going to be breaking skulls anytime soon, his repo men came in and cracked you open like a salvage claim." Garrett closed his eyes. The cheap synthetic shutters whirred loudly. He remembered the arrogant weight of his own body. He remembered walking through the lower levels, watching dock workers press themselves against the bulkheads to avoid catching his eye. He had been a predator, an apex construct of muscle and corporate capital. Now he was just a pile of discarded, downgraded spare parts. "Braddock stripped me," Garrett whispered, the reality slowly settling over him like a suffocating blanket. "Don't take it personally. It's a ledger, nothing more." Simon finally met his gaze. "He left you the essential organs. I had to source some bargain bin cybernetics to bridge the gaps in your nervous system. You've got a 3rd-gen voice box, commercial-grade optical sensors, which is why your color perception is probably shot right now, and standard civilian motor relays." Garrett swung his legs over the side of the bed. The movement was agonizingly slow. His brain sent the command to his legs, but the signal lagged, traveling through cheap copper wiring instead of zero-latency optical fibers. His feet hit the cold deck plating. He felt the chill instantly. He hadn't felt the temperature of a floor in a decade. His old combat boots had internal climate control. "I wouldn't do that yet," Simon warned, leaning back against a rusted surgical sink. Garrett ignored him. He gripped the edge of the metal mattress and pushed himself up. Gravity hit him like a physical blow. The station's artificial gravity was set to standard Earth norm, a setting he used to barely register. Now, without his hydraulic assists, it felt as though invisible hands were dragging his shoulders toward the floor. His knees buckled immediately. He hit the deck hard, his wasted shoulder absorbing the impact. The shockwave rattled his teeth, the few real ones he had left, and sent a blinding spike of nausea through his skull. He lay there, his cheek pressed against the freezing oil-stained steel, gasping for air. He smelled bleach. He smelled old blood. He smelled his own sour, unwashed skin. He waited for the rage to come. He waited for the blinding red-hot fury that used to fuel his bar fights and intimidation jobs. He wanted to scream Braddock's name. He wanted to swear bloody vengeance on the little earther mechanic who had planted her feet and shattered his empire with a single swing. But the rage wasn't there. Instead, there was only a profound freezing clarity. The arrogance was gone, bled out of him over 250 days of unconsciousness. The earther hadn't just broken his jaw. She had exposed a fatal flaw in his entire existence. He had relied on bought strength. He had confused leased armor with actual resilience. Garrett pressed his palms flat against the deck. His wrists trembled wildly. The servos in his forearms whined, protesting the effort of lifting his diminished body weight. He didn't try to stand all at once. He dragged his knees under his chest. He breathed in the foul air of the med bay, letting the sting of the antiseptic clear his head. "Get up, tough guy," Simon murmured, his voice lacking its earlier bite. It wasn't an insult. It was a quiet clinical observation. Garrett gritted his teeth. He pushed. His joints popped. A sharp tearing pain ripped through his right side, where a muscle adhesion snapped under the tension. He ignored it. He forced his legs to straighten, locking his shaking knees. He stood there, swaying, hunched over, staring at a rust stain on the floor. He wasn't a Goliath anymore. He was a ghost. And ghosts didn't need heavy armor to haunt the people who put them in the ground. Sparks rained down, stinging the exposed sliver of skin between Maeve's heavy leather gloves and the frayed cuff of her canvas jacket. She flinched, biting down on her lower lip, but kept her thumb firmly pressed against the plasma torch's trigger. The air in the maintenance crawl space was suffocating. It smelled of burnt flux oxidized aluminum and the stale sweat soaking through her undershirt. She was wedged upside down between two massive cooling pipes aboard a freighter that had seen better days trying to patch a hairline microfracture before it ruptured and vented the ship's primary coolant into the void. Her right hand ached. It didn't throb anymore. It just hummed with a low-grade perpetual stiffness. She killed the torch and flipped her welding mask up, wiping a smear of grease and sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist. She looked at her right hand. The knuckles were swollen, permanently disfigured into a knot of uneven calcium deposits. Earth gravity built dense bones, but zero-G medical clinics didn't know how to set them properly. The fracture had healed slightly out of alignment. Her grip strength was down 20%, and every time the station's humidity spiked, her hand felt like it was packed with crushed glass. It was a daily painful reminder of the dockyard. Maeve grabbed her wrench with her left hand and began tightening the sealing bolts over the weld. 8 months had passed since she dropped the Void-born enforcer. For the first few weeks, she had looked over her shoulder constantly. She had kept a sharpened heavy-duty screwdriver tucked into her boot, expecting Braddock's thugs to corner her in an alley. She expected retaliation. It never came. Instead, the dockyards had just absorbed the violence. The giant's absence created a brief vacuum, quickly filled by 3 other heavily augmented thugs who were too busy fighting each other to care about the mechanic who had caused the opening. Life moved on. The machinery broke down, Maeve fixed it, and the station kept spinning. A heavy metallic thud echoed down the access shaft. Maeve froze. Her hand tightened instinctively around the heavy steel wrench. The sound wasn't the ambient groan of the ship's hull settling. It was the deliberate rhythmic sound of magnetic-soled boots engaging with the deck plating. Someone was climbing up into her crawl space. She shifted her body, bracing her boots against the cooling pipe, and raised the wrench. A head popped through the access hatch. It wasn't a thug. It was a man with slicked-back dark hair wearing a high-collared jacket that cost more than Maeve made in a solar year. He smelled strongly of synthetic sandalwood and expensive tobacco, a jarring contrast to the grime of the shaft. "Maeve," the man said smoothly. He didn't sound out of breath, despite the climb. He looked at the raised wrench and offered a thin, practiced smile. "You can put that down. If I wanted you dead, I wouldn't have worn my good coat into a ventilation duct." Maeve didn't lower the wrench. "Who are you?" "You're blocking my exit. Name is Wyatt. I represent Mr. Braddock." He casually wiped a speck of rust off his lapel. "We've been keeping an eye on you for the last few months. Your work is efficient, both with a plasma torch and with your fists." "I'm a mechanic," Maeve said, her voice flat. "I fix scrubbers. I weld pipes. I don't do muscle work." "Nobody is asking you to break legs," Wyatt chuckled, though his eyes remained cold and calculating. "Mr. Braddock has a very specific problem. The men he hired to replace Garrett lack discipline. They rely entirely on their expensive augmentations. They have no tactical sense, no grit. Mr. Braddock appreciates the raw, unadulterated physics of what you did to Garrett. He wants to hire you as a consultant." Maeve stared at him. She felt a surge of profound irritation. It was the same irritation she felt when a client tried to tell her how to bypass a blown fuse. They were looking at the universe through a distorted lens. A consultant, Maeve repeated, testing the word. It tasted stupid. "Teach our enforcers how baseline humans fight. Teach them structural weak points. You get double your current union rate, a private bunk on the upper levels, and full medical coverage." Wyatt glanced pointedly at her disfigured hand. "We could even have a specialist re-break and set that paw of yours. Make it good as new." Maeve slowly lowered the wrench. She didn't relax her posture. She looked at Wyatt, really looked at him. He was soft. Under the expensive fabric, he was just another station-born administrator playing a game of numbers. "You think I used a secret technique," Maeve said, her voice dripping with exhausted condescension. "You think I know some ancient martial art." Wyatt frowned. "You bypassed Class 4 dermal plating with a single strike. That requires localized knowledge. It requires gravity," Maeve snapped. "It requires growing up on a rock where just standing up takes effort." "I don't have a technique, Wyatt. I was backed into a corner. I was pissed off, and I threw my weight. I got lucky his combat wire shorted out. If it hadn't, he would have ripped my head off. I'm not a fighter. I don't want to be your consultant." Wyatt's smile finally slipped away. The air in the crawl space seemed to grow colder. "Mr. Braddock doesn't like to be refused, Maeve. It's an incredibly generous offer. Find another Earther." Maeve picked up her plasma torch and turned back to the pipe. "Job's done. Clear the hatch. I need to invoice the captain." Wyatt lingered for a moment, the silence stretching taut between them. When he spoke again, his tone had lost its smooth corporate polish. It was rougher-edged with quiet malice. "You might want to reconsider the protection our organization offers," Maeve Wyatt said softly. Maeve paused, her thumb resting on the torch ignition. "Why? Because Simon ran out of sedatives 2 days ago," Wyatt replied, rapping his knuckles against the steel hatch. Garrett woke up. "And from what my spies in the clinic tell me, he's learning how to walk again. Have a pleasant shift, mechanic." Wyatt slipped down the hatch, the heavy clanking of his boots fading into the bowels of the ship. Maeve stood perfectly still in the cramped dark. Her bad hand began to throb a deep, rhythmic pulse of phantom pain echoing in the swollen bone. Walking was an insult. It was a gross, humiliating parody of the locomotion Garrett used to take for granted. He gripped the parallel steel bars Simon had welded to the clinic wall, his knuckles turning white beneath pale, paper-thin skin. Sweat cold and sour stung his eyes. He commanded his right leg to lift. A full second passed. Then the cheap civilian-grade servos implanted in his hip whined a high, pathetic squeal like a dying rat, and his foot scraped forward across the deck plating. He didn't step. He dragged. "Breathe," Simon muttered from his workbench, not even looking up from the tangled mess of optical wiring he was soldering. "You're holding your breath again. Your synthetic lungs were repossessed. Remember? You have to manually operate the meat ones." Garrett exhaled a ragged, wet sound. His chest heaved. Just standing upright felt like he had a rucksack full of depleted uranium strapped to his spine. He shifted his weight to the right leg and tried to bring his left foot forward. His knee buckled. The lag between his brain's command and the mechanical relay was just a fraction of a second too long. He hit the floor hard. There was no dampening field, no subdermal shock absorbers. The impact rattled straight through his frail collarbone and directly into his jaw, sending a blinding white-hot flash of agony through his half-healed skull. He lay there, his face pressed against the cold, antiseptic-smelling steel, a string of drool slipping from his mouth. He wanted to stay down. The floor was solid. The floor didn't demand anything. "You're going to pull out your IV tap if you keep throwing yourself at the deck," Simon remarked, casually, taking a sip from a stained mug. Garrett closed his eyes. The rage wasn't a roaring fire anymore. It was a slow, agonizing rot in his gut. It wasn't directed at the Earther. Not entirely. It was directed at Braddock. Braddock, who had stripped him bare while he slept. Braddock, who had turned him from a predator into this broken marionette. He pressed his palms against the floor. His wrists trembled. The tendons in his forearms stood out like strained cables. Slowly, agonizingly, he pushed himself back up to his knees, gripping the parallel bars. Why, Garrett croaked. His voice was a static-laced whisper. "Why keep me alive, Simon?" "You paid your tab in advance, mostly," Simon replied, wiping a smudge of thermal paste off his chin. "And honestly, scientific curiosity. A brain injury that massive should have reduced you to organic slurry. I wanted to see if the human nervous system could reboot itself through third-rate garbage wire. Apparently, it can. Barely." Garrett pulled himself to his feet. His breath rattled in his throat. He looked at his reflection in the polished metal cabinet across the room. He barely recognized the creature staring back. He was still tall, but he was skeletal. The massive width of his shoulders was gone, replaced by a hollow, sunken chest. His skin was the color of old ash draped loosely over pronounced collarbones and ribs. The dermal plating that used to cover his jaw had been roughly sawed off, leaving a jagged, puckered scar that ran from his earlobe to his chin. His left eye was a cheap red glowing optic that didn't quite track in sync with his natural right eye. He looked like a corpse that had clawed its way out of the reclamation vats. "I need clothes," Garrett rasped, "and a cane." Simon finally turned around, raising an eyebrow behind his magnifier. A cane. The terror of the lower docks wants a walking stick. "I think I have a length of high-density polymer piping in the scrap bin." "But you aren't leaving this clinic, Garrett. The gravity out there will crush you. And if the gravity doesn't, the first scavenger who recognizes your face will. I can't stay here." Garrett tested his grip on the bars. "Braddock knows I'm awake, which is exactly why you should stay." "No." Garrett looked back at his gaunt reflection. "If I stay, I'm hiding. If I'm hiding, I'm prey. I need to walk." An hour later, Garrett stepped through the heavy blast doors of the clinic and into the main concourse of Sector 4. The sensory assault was immediate and violent. Without his high-end audio dampeners, the noise of the station was a physical force. The screech of transit trams, the chaotic babble of a dozen different trade dialects, the heavy rhythmic thud of industrial loaders, it all slammed into his unprotected eardrums, making his vision blur. The air was thick-heavy with the stench of recycled sweat, frying synthetic proteins and leaking engine coolant. It was overwhelming. He leaned heavily on the polymer pipe Simon had given him, his knuckles white. A burly dock worker, carrying a crate of hydrospanners, didn't even look up as he barged past. His shoulder clipped Garrett. 6 months ago, that dock worker would have bounced off Garrett's armored chest, apologizing profusely while backing away. Today, the glancing blow spun Garrett around. His cheap knee servo locked up, and he crashed into a dirty corrugated bulkhead, the pipe clattering to the floor. The dock worker paused, glancing back. He didn't recognize the skeletal giant clutching his ribcage. He just sneered. "Watch your step, scrap meat." Garrett slumped against the wall. His heart hammered wildly against his ribs, a frantic bird-like fluttering. He reached down with a shaking hand and retrieved his pipe. He didn't shout after the man. He didn't threaten him. He just breathed. He felt the aching cold of the wall behind his back. He felt the terrifying, humiliating weakness in his legs. He was at the bottom. But as he stood there, watching the crowds flow past him, completely indifferent to his existence, a strange dark clarity washed over him. He was no longer bound by the arrogance of the armor. He was no longer a blunt instrument. He looked down at his own trembling, unaugmented hands. The Earther had broken him with pure, unadulterated physics. She had planted her feet in the reality of gravity while he had been living a corporate-sponsored fantasy. He needed to find her. He needed to understand how a creature so fragile could hit so incredibly hard. Grease under her fingernails usually meant a good day, but tonight Maeve couldn't scrub the black stains out fast enough. She stood over the tiny aluminum sink in her cramped quarters, the harsh chemical soap burning the micro-cuts on her knuckles. The water ran a rusty brown before turning lukewarm and clear. She scrubbed until her skin was raw, her eyes fixed on the cracked mirror above the basin. She looked exhausted. Dark bruised bags hung under her eyes, and her pale hair was plastered to her forehead with stale sweat. Her right hand throbbed. The dull, persistent ache radiated from the unevenly healed bone in her knuckles all the way up to her elbow. It was a barometer for her stress, and right now it felt like it was on fire. Wyatt's words echoed in her skull. Garrett woke up. He's learning how to walk again. She shut off the tap with a jerky twist of her wrist. She wasn't an action hero. She didn't have a secret stash of military hardware hidden under her floorboards. She was a mechanic who barely scraped together enough credits to eat real protein twice a week. Maeve walked over to her cot and sat heavily on the thin, lumpy mattress. She reached under her pillow and pulled out the only weapon she owned, a heavy-duty, high-torque pneumatic rivet gun. It was a brutal, ugly tool designed to drive steel spikes through starship hull plating. It was heavy, unbalanced, and had a range of exactly 0 meters. She checked the compressed air cartridge. It was full. She laid it carefully on the blanket beside her thigh. Paranoia was an exhausting companion. Every clank of the ventilation system, every distant shout from the lower decks made her chest tighten. She knew how the station worked. When an enforcer was humiliated, they didn't just let it go. They made an example. They had to, or the entire ecosystem of fear that kept them employed would collapse. And Garrett was the apex of that ecosystem. Or he used to be. Maeve rubbed her temples, trying to massage away a brewing headache. She couldn't hide in her room forever. The scrubbers in Sector 7 were failing, and the Union dispatcher had already pinged her datapad 3 times. If she didn't work, she didn't eat. She grabbed her heavy canvas work jacket, wincing as she pushed her stiff right arm through the sleeve. She tucked the rivet gun into the deep, oil-stained pocket. Its heavy, cold weight against her hip offered a small, miserable comfort. The corridors of Sector 7 were a maze of exposed plumbing and flickering neon. The air here was damp-smelling heavily of ozone and mildew. Water dripped steadily from condensation traps overhead, pooling in dark, iridescent puddles on the grated floor. Maeve kept her head down her boots, splashing softly through the damp. She gripped her heavy tool bag in her left hand, her right hand resting casually inside her pocket, fingers curled around the grip of the rivet gun. She reached the access panel for the atmospheric processor. It was tucked away in a dead-end service alcove, shadowed and claustrophobic. She set her bag down and pulled out a diagnostic scanner. That was when she heard it. Clack, scrape, clack, scrape. The sound was rhythmic, but uneven. It was the sound of something heavy being dragged, followed by the sharp tap of a solid object against the steel grating. Maeve froze. The hair on the back of her neck stood up a primal alarm bell, screaming in her nervous system. She dropped the scanner. It clattered against the floor, loud in the damp silence. She slowly turned around, pulling the rivet gun from her pocket. She raised it with both hands, the heavy metal barrel shaking slightly. Her breathing became shallow and fast. She planted her feet, just like she had 8 months ago, digging her boots into the grating. A figure emerged from the shadows at the end of the alcove. Maeve's heart slammed against her ribs. She tightened her finger on the trigger, ready to fire a 3-inch steel spike directly into center mass. But she didn't fire. The breath caught in her throat. It was Garrett, but it wasn't the monster she remembered. The massive, imposing titan of dermal armor and hydraulic muscle was gone. In his place stood a gaunt, shivering specter. He was wearing oversized, dirty coveralls that hung off his skeletal frame like a collapsed tent. He leaned heavily on a piece of crude plastic, piping his knuckles, protruding sharply against his pale skin. His face was a ruined landscape. The terrifying smooth jaw plating was gone, revealing a horrific, jagged trench of scar tissue. One of his eyes glowed a dim, erratic red. The other was bloodshot and ringed with dark exhaustion. He stopped 10 feet away. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't reach for a weapon. He just stood there, swaying slightly, the plastic pipe trembling under his weight. He looked at the heavy rivet gun aimed at his chest. Then he looked up at Maeve's face. There was no smirk, no arrogance, just a hollow, overwhelming exhaustion that mirrored her own. The silence stretched thick and suffocating, broken only by the drip of condensation and the jagged whistling sound of Garrett's breathing. Maeve didn't lower the gun. Her right hand ached furiously, the bad bone throbbing in time with her racing pulse. Garrett's synthetic voice box clicked a cheap, staticky pop that sounded incredibly loud in the quiet alcove. "I'm not here to fight," he rasped the words, crackling with interference. He swayed again, his cheap knee servo whining in protest. "I just needed to see if you were real." Condensation dripped off a corroded pressure valve overhead, striking the puddle between them with a flat, hollow smack. It was the only sound in the alcove besides the ragged whistling pull of Garrett's damaged lungs. Maeve didn't lower the heavy rivet gun. Her shoulders burned with the effort of holding the clumsy tool steady. Her thumb rested entirely over the firing stud. She stared at the skeletal giant, searching for the trick. There was always a trick in the lower levels. Thugs didn't just find Jesus and apologize. They lured you in and snapped your neck. But looking at Garrett, there was nothing left to snap a neck with. His oversized canvas coveralls looked like a shroud. The hand gripping the plastic pipe was a map of bruised veins and atrophied tendons. He was shivering. It wasn't a nervous tremor. It was the deep, uncontrollable shudder of a body stripped of its thermoregulatory implants, failing to cope with the damp chill of Sector 7. Real, Maeve spat the word tasting sour. What are you talking about, backup? Get away from the access panel. Garrett didn't move backward. He simply let his legs give out. The cheap hip servos groaned a pathetic dying note, and he collapsed. He didn't brace himself. He just folded, hitting the wet grating with a wet thud, his plastic pipe clattering away into the dark. He ended up sitting with his back slumped against the rusted bulkhead, his chin resting on his hollow chest. Maeve flinched, the rivet gun jerking up, but she didn't fire. She stood there, her chest heaving, staring at the ruin of the man who had nearly taken her life 8 months ago. They took the armor, Garrett rasped. He didn't look up. He stared at his own shaking hands resting in his lap. His voice box spat out words laced with static, sounding like a broken radio transmission. Braddock took it. The hydraulics, the plating, the lungs. 8 months in the dark, and when I woke up, I was just meat. Maeve finally lowered the gun a few inches. The sheer absurdity of the situation warred with her exhaustion. And you came all the way down here to cry about it to the woman who put you in a coma. Go to a med clinic. Go to a bar. I have work to do. Wyatt found you, Garrett stated. It wasn't a question. Maeve's grip tightened on the handle. He made an offer. I told him to go to hell. Garrett let out a sound that might have been a laugh, but it came out as a wet, clicking wheeze. He finally lifted his head. The mismatched eyes, one organic and bloodshot, one cheap, glowing red, fixed on her. Braddock doesn't take no. You're a liability now, an anomaly. You proved his expensive hardware can be beaten by a baseline human in a greasy jacket. I hit you in a blind spot. Maeve snapped, her irritation flaring hot and sudden. I used leverage. It's physics, not magic. I'm not a threat to his empire. It doesn't matter what it is, Garrett said slowly. It only matters how it looks. If an Earther can crack a Class 4 enforcer, then the dock workers might start getting ideas. They might stop paying protection. They might stop moving out of the way. You broke the illusion, Maeve. He knew her name. That sent a fresh spike of ice down her spine. So why are you here? She demanded. To collect a bounty. Try it. No. Garrett leaned his head back against the cold steel. I'm dead anyway. Without the meds, without the upkeep. My nervous system is chewing through this garbage wire. I came because I didn't believe it. I needed to see the monster that put me down. He paused, his red optic clicking as it tried to focus. But you're just small. You're just a tired mechanic. Yeah, Maeve said, her voice dropping, the anger leaking out to leave only the bone-deep weariness. Just a mechanic. She finally lowered the rivet gun, completely letting her arm hang at her side. Her hand throbbed mercilessly. She looked at the giant sitting in the puddle of dirty water. He looked pathetic. He smelled like cheap antiseptic and fear. You can't stay here, Maeve told him, turning her back halfway to pick up her dropped diagnostic scanner. The union will send a foreman if I don't get this scrubber back online. If they see you. Maeve. Garrett's voice was suddenly sharp, the static clearing for a fraction of a second. It carried an edge of the old enforcer, a primal warning. Maeve froze. She heard it too. Clink. Scrape. It wasn't a clumsy dragging footstep. It was the synchronized, deliberate tread of magnetic boots disengaging and re-engaging with the deck plating. Multiple pairs, moving fast, sweeping the corridor behind her. "Wyatt's men," Garrett whispered. He tried to push himself up his arms, shaking violently. "They followed me, or they were coming for you anyway. Doesn't matter now." Maeve looked down at the heavy rivet gun in her hand. It fired one spike at a time. It took 3 seconds to cycle the pneumatic piston. There were at least 3 heavy sets of footsteps echoing down the main corridor, cutting off her only exit. She was trapped in a dead-end alcove with a broken cyborg. Shadows stretched long and distorted across the grated floor as the beam of a high-lumen tactical light swept past the alcove's entrance. The air grew thick. Maeve could smell the distinct sharp odor of charged plasma cells, the kind used in military-grade sidearms, illegal on the station, unless you owned the local security forces. Braddock clearly owned them. "Check the maintenance junction," a voice barked. It was synthetic, deep, heavily modified. Another void-born brute. Wyatt said the tracker pinged somewhere in Sector 7. Maeve pressed her back flush against the cold machinery of the atmospheric processor. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the frantic hammering in her chest. Beside her on the floor, Garrett had managed to drag himself into a crouch. He looked awful, his skin sickly pale under the flickering neon, but his eyes were entirely focused. He was a predator, stripped of his fangs, relying purely on old instincts. He reached up and grabbed the hem of Maeve's jacket, giving it a sharp tug. She glared down at him. He pointed a trembling, bruised finger toward a heavy, red-painted valve wheel situated chest-high on the processor tank. It was the primary coolant override. Maeve shook her head frantically. No. Venting raw Freon substitute in a confined space would blind them, freeze their lungs, and trigger a station-wide lockdown. Garrett didn't argue. He just held up 3 fingers. Then 2. Footsteps crunched on the loose rust right outside the alcove. A beam of white light sliced through the darkness, illuminating the puddle where Garrett had been sitting moments before. Garrett dropped his final finger. Maeve didn't think. Instinct forged by a life of reacting to failing machinery took over. She swung the heavy rivet gun like a club, smashing the steel barrel directly into the rusty locking pin of the red valve wheel. The pin sheared off with a sharp crack. She dropped the gun and grabbed the wheel with both hands, throwing her entire body weight backward to spin it open. The resulting explosion of sound was deafening. A high-pressure jet of supercooled white vapor blasted out of the valve, screaming like a dying banshee. The temperature in the alcove plummeted instantly. Frost crystallized on Maeve's eyelashes in a fraction of a second. The vapor hit the corridor, instantly expanding into an impenetrable, blinding cloud of sub-zero fog. A startled shout echoed from the corridor, immediately followed by the deafening crack of a plasma discharge. A bolt of blue energy seared through the fog, missing Maeve's head by inches and striking the bulkhead behind her. The heat of it instantly vaporized the frost on her face, smelling of cooked ozone and burnt hair. "Move!" Garrett roared, his cheap voice box distorted, shrieking with feedback. He didn't wait for her. Using the last reserves of strength in his withered legs, Garrett launched himself out of the alcove directly into the freezing fog. Maeve heard a heavy impact, a grunt of surprise from one of the thugs, and the sickening sound of metal crunching against bone. She grabbed her rivet gun off the deck, her fingers numb and clumsy from the cold, and bolted after him. The corridor was a chaotic blur of white vapor and flashing blue plasma fire. The supercooled gas was wreaking havoc on the thug's optics. Maeve burst out of the alcove just in time to see Garrett locked in a desperate grapple with a massive enforcer. The enforcer was fully armored, gleaming with brushed steel dermal plates. Garrett was nothing but skin and bone. He had his arms wrapped around the thug's thick neck, dragging him downward. But it was a losing battle. The enforcer simply planted his feet, grabbed Garrett by his thin, scarred throat, and slammed him backward into the corridor wall. The impact sounded like a dropped bag of wet meat. Garrett slumped, gasping, pinning the thug against the wall, purely with his collapsing body weight. "Kill the Earther!" the pinned enforcer yelled to a second figure emerging from the fog. The second thug raised a heavy plasma pistol, the emitter coils whining as they charged. He had a clear shot at Maeve. Maeve didn't stop running. She didn't try to dodge. Earth gravity had taught her that momentum was a weapon. She dropped her shoulder, tightened her grip on the heavy pneumatic tool, and drove it forward like a battering ram. She didn't aim for his armored chest. She aimed for his knee. Her shoulder slammed into the thug's thigh, just as she drove the heavy steel mass of the rivet gun directly into the unarmored joint of his mechanical knee brace. The physics were ruthless. The heavy mass of the tool, moving at the speed of a sprinting human, transferred its kinetic energy directly into a hinge designed only to move backward and forward. The joint snapped outward with a noise like a rifle shot. The thug screamed a distinctly human sound of agony that bypassed his voice synthesizer and collapsed sideways. His plasma pistol discharged wildly into the ceiling, showering sparks and molten metal down on them. Maeve rolled over his thrashing body, scraping her elbows raw on the grating, and scrambled to her feet. She turned toward the first enforcer, who was just preparing to throw Garrett's limp body aside. She raised the rivet gun, planted her feet, and slammed her thumb against the firing stud. The pneumatic piston fired with a concussive thump. A 3-inch steel spike punched entirely through the enforcer's heavy leather boot and pinned his foot to the steel grating of the floor. He roared, dropping Garrett and reaching down to claw at his trapped foot. Maeve didn't wait to see if he got loose. She grabbed Garrett by the collar of his oversized jacket. He was dead weight, his red optic flickering erratically, blood leaking from the jagged scar on his jaw. "Get up!" she screamed, hauling him upward. Her bad hand screamed in agony, feeling like it was tearing apart at the seams. "Walk, you son of a bitch, walk!" Garrett coughed a fine mist of blood spraying his lips. His legs kicked uselessly for a second before his cheap servos engaged. Leaning heavily on her shoulder, the broken giant and the exhausted mechanic stumbled away into the freezing fog, leaving the crippled thugs screaming in the dark. Cold air tore at Maeve's throat like swallowed glass. She dragged Garrett through the labyrinth of Sector 7's lower transit tubes, their boots slipping on patches of rapidly thawing condensation. The heavy blast doors of an abandoned water reclamation pump station loomed ahead, rusted, half shut. She shoved Garrett through the narrow gap first. He collapsed immediately on the other side, a tangle of long, useless limbs and cheap sparking wire. Maeve squeezed through after him, her boots kicking a rusted steel pipe into the heavy door track to jam it. She slumped against the reinforced bulkhead, sliding down until her knees hit the cracked concrete floor. Total darkness swallowed them. For a long time, the only sound was the harsh, wet rhythm of their breathing. Maeve's right hand didn't just throb anymore. It screamed. The poorly healed bones felt like they were vibrating, grinding against each other with every frantic heartbeat. She tucked the hand tightly into her armpit, curling into a shivering ball. The adrenaline was evaporating from her bloodstream, leaving behind a cold, nauseating void in her stomach. "My leg!" Garrett wheezed somewhere in the pitch black. The synthetic buzz of his voice box was barely audible over the low hum of a distant station generator. The hip servo, it stripped the gears. I don't care, Maeve whispered. Her voice cracked dry and brittle. She didn't have the energy for anger. She just felt entirely hollowed out. I really, really don't care. You should have left me to them, probably. Maeve rested the back of her head against the cold steel door. But a corpse is heavy, and I didn't want to trip over you in the fog. A sharp chemical smell began to fill the cramped space. Ozone and melting plastic. Garrett was literally burning out. His cheap civilian wiring was never meant to handle the sudden massive spikes of biological adrenaline and physical trauma of a firefight. Maeve fumbled in her jacket pocket with her good hand, pulling out a heavy-duty inspection penlight. She clicked it on. The harsh white beam cut through the dark, illuminating the pump station. It was a concrete box filled with dead machinery, coated in a thick, choking layer of undisturbed gray dust. She swung the beam toward Garrett. He looked like a casualty of a forgotten war. His oversized coveralls were torn at the shoulder, revealing pale skin, bruised and ugly mottled purple. His right eye was closed, tight swollen shut from the impact against the corridor wall. The red optic in his left socket flickered wildly, casting erratic crimson shadows against the concrete. He had his hands clamped over his right hip, where a thin curl of acrid black smoke was rising through the fabric of his pants. Maeve crawled over to him, her knees scraping the rough floor. "Move your hands!" Garrett didn't argue. He let his arms drop flat against the dust. Maeve pulled a heavy multi-tool from her belt, snapping open a short serrated blade. She sliced through the tough canvas of his coveralls, exposing the cheap plastic casing of the hip servo. The housing was melting, bubbling around the edges where the motor had seized and aggressively overheated. She didn't hesitate. She jammed the tip of the multi-tool into the casing gap and pried it open, severing the internal copper wires with a sharp twist of her wrist. The motor died with a pathetic grinding squeak. The smoke stopped. "There," Maeve said, rocking back on her heels, gasping for breath. "You won't catch fire, but you aren't walking anymore." Garrett stared straight up at the invisible ceiling. "I couldn't walk anyway, not really." The silence returned heavier this time. It pressed down on them thick with the realization of what they had just done. You didn't shoot Braddock's enforcers shatter their kneecaps and go back to work the next cycle. You didn't break the cardinal rules of the lower docks and expect the station to just keep spinning. "They'll lock down the sector," Garrett stated, his voice utterly flat. "Wyatt isn't stupid. He knows you can't run far. He knows I can't run at all. They'll sweep the vents, the pump stations, the crawl spaces. They'll find this door." "Let them," Maeve muttered, turning the penlight off to save the battery. The absolute darkness rushed back in. "I have 5 spikes left for the rivet gun. 5 spikes won't stop a corporate kill squad earther." Maeve let out a short, bitter laugh that ended in a cough. "My name is Maeve, and you're right, it won't, but I'm tired. I'm so incredibly tired of this station, of the debt. If they come through that door, I'll take Wyatt's knee out just to watch him crawl, and then I'll sleep." Garrett shifted the movement, accompanied by the wet sound of tearing scabs. "You aren't a killer." "Neither are you, apparently," she shot back. "You're just a bully who lost his expensive toys." "I was." Garrett's voice dropped the synthetic static, fading slightly, leaving a raw human rasp beneath it. "I was exactly that. I thought the metal made me a god. But you planted your feet. You didn't have armor. You just had the dirt you came from." Maeve closed her eyes in the dark. The memory of the punch, the sickening crack of his jaw, The white-hot agony in her own hand was burned deep into her muscle memory. "It's just physics, Garrett. It's gravity," he corrected quietly. "Earth gravity. It makes things dense. It makes things incredibly hard to break. Braddock's men are like me. They grew up in the void. They're fragile beneath the steel." He paused, his breathing ragged but steady. "You broke his men out there. You crippled one and pinned the other. You didn't use tech. You used a heavy tool and your shoulder. What's your point?" "My point is that Braddock is terrified of you." The red glow of Garrett's optic flared in the dark, illuminating his heavily scarred face. He was looking directly at her. "He rules through the illusion of invincibility. You shattered it. If we wait here, we die in the dark. But if we move, if we go up to the administrative levels—" Maeve stared at him, her bad hand clutched against her chest. "You're insane. You can't even stand." "I don't need to stand to show them a ghost," Garrett said, a grim, humorless smile touching the unscarred side of his mouth. "They think I'm a monster waking up. Let them see me. Let them focus on the fallen giant. While they look at me, you plant your feet again. You hit Braddock." Maeve looked down at her swollen, ruined hand. She thought about the endless grueling shifts, the constant smell of ozone, the crushing fear of missing a union payment. She thought about Wyatt's clean, expensive jacket invading her filthy crawl space. She didn't want to be a hero, she just wanted her credits. But the universe, it seemed, wasn't accepting standard currency anymore. "I'm going to need a bigger wrench," Maeve said softly into the dark. Garrett let out a slow, static-laced exhale. It sounded almost like relief. "Simon has a heavy plasma cutter in his shop. It's on the way." Maeve clicked the penlight back on. The harsh beam washed over the broken cyborg and the dirty concrete. It was an ugly, miserable reality. But for the first time in 8 months, the crushing weight in Maeve's chest didn't feel quite so heavy. She stood up, her joints popping loudly in the cold air, and offered Garrett her good hand. "Did you enjoy this gritty tale of survival and gravity? If you want to see Maeve and Garrett take the fight to the upper levels, please smash that like button, share this video with your fellow sci-fi fans who love a grounded human perspective. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new story. Drop a comment down below right now. What weapon should Maeve choose?